Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to unpack what's happening in Congress and, figure out why it matters to you.
Mm. And today, we've got a snapshot excerpts from the Congressional Record for June 10th, 2025.
It's like the official minutes, right, of the House and Senate floors.
Exactly. Gives you a real feel for what lawmakers are focused on, the procedures, the debates, the whole picture for that day.
So our goal is to dig into these pages, pull out the key stuff, give you the context, and connect the dots to why it's relevant.
Right. We'll have the legislative highlights, the political back and forth, and try to make sense of it all.
Okay, so let's jump in. A lot of House time based on this was on procedures, specifically something called House Resolution 489.
Yeah, HRES 489.
Okay.
And understanding what that is pretty crucial.
It's not the actual law being debated, it's the rule book for the debate itself.
Precisely. It dictates how long they can talk, what amendments get considered, basically setting the stage for votes on other specific bills.
And the votes on this rule itself, they were close.
Oh yeah, razor thin, like 213 to 206 to cut off debate, and then 211 to 206 to actually adopt the rule.
Wow. So that tells you right away.
Tells you the bills being enabled by this rule were probably pretty controversial, tightly contested.
And what were those bills? What did HRES 489 unlock?
It was a package deal, 4 bills, 3 related to the District of Columbia, H.R. 884, H.R. 2056, and H.R. 2096, and 1 focused on fentanyl, S331.
The HLT Fentanyl Act. Okay. That whole package seems like a major focus then.
Definitely. And those D.C. bills, H.R. 2096 and H.R. 884, they sparked a lot of debate. Really worth digging into.
They seem to hit that core tension, don't they? D.C. wanting to govern itself home rule versus Congress having that constitutional authority over the district.
Exactly. And you see totally different takes on things like public safety, police discipline, even who gets to vote locally.
Okay, let's take H.R. 2096 first, the police discipline one. What was the argument for it?
Well, supporters, mainly Republicans in this account, painted a picture of a public safety crisis in D.C. Throughout stats like, fifth deadliest city, recent shootings.
And they tied this to the police force being understaffed.
Right, about 800 officers short, they said. And they blamed, quote, reckless policies for hurting recruitment and retention.
So the bill, in their view, was about fixing that.
Yeah, they framed it as restoring basic bargaining rights or procedural protections for officers. And they argued Congress had a duty, a constitutional duty, to step in and help the MPD fight crime. They also noted the National Fraternal Order of Police backed the bill.
Okay, so what was the counter-argument from opponents like Democrats or the D.C. Council itself?
A completely different perspective. They called the bill an attack on our nation's capital, said it was Congress overriding carefully considered local laws.
Overriding laws about what specifically?
About police discipline. They argued the bill rolls back the D.C. Council's efforts to hold officers accountable, strips the police chief's power to impose discipline. Basically, they argued it undermines public safety.
And they had evidence for that.
They pointed to a 2022 D.C. auditor's report. It apparently detailed cases where the MPD couldn't fire officers for pretty serious stuff. Sexual violence, lying, misusing firearms, even sleeping on duty.
And they mentioned something about a statute of limitations.
Yeah, that the bill would bring back a 90-day limit for disciplinary cases, which opponents claim officers used in the past to just run out the clock on accountability. Plus, they stressed that every MPD chief for 15 years supported the reforms this bill would undo.
So their bottom line was Congress shouldn't be micromanaging local D.C. police matters.
Exactly. Let the local leaders and the police chiefs handle it. So you see these fundamentally clashing views on how best to support police and ensure accountability.
Both sides claiming their way leads to better public safety.
Right. But proposing opposite solutions.
Okay, that same dynamic, federal versus local, really flared up with the other big D.C. bill, H.R. 884.
Oh, absolutely. This one aimed to repeal a D.C. law that lets non-citizens vote in local elections.
And the arguments for this bill?
Supporters called it common sense,
Yeah.
about strong election integrity. One representative was quoted asking, why colleagues would want foreigners to vote in D.C.
Any comparisons made?
Yeah. Interestingly, a comparison to Georgia's controversial 2021 election law and this idea that D.C. was becoming a petri dish for policies they didn't like, with excitement expressed about President Trump possibly signing this repeal.
And the pushback from opponents.
Strong pushback. Again, framed as an attack on D.C.'s autonomy, repealing a duly enacted law. The argument was D.C. should handle its own local affairs.
They accused supporters of just trying to score political points.
Specifically, demonizing immigrants was the phrase used. They stress, and this is key, The D.C. law only allows non-citizen voting in local races, mayor, council, school board, not federal elections.
Which is already illegal anyway for non-citizens.
Right. And they countered the idea that this was unprecedented. They pointed to history, saying non-citizens used to vote in lots of places, even at the founding.
And the core argument, again, was about jurisdiction.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That Congress shouldn't legislate purely local D.C. matters. And they highlighted the irony. D.C. residents have no voting representation in Congress, so Congress dictating their local laws feels like, quote, the antithesis of democracy.
So it's way bigger than just this one voting law.
It really is. It's about who holds power locally, the history of voting rights, and that whole unique, often tense relationship between D.C. and Congress.
Okay, briefly, that package also included the Fentanyl Act, S-331. What was the tone around that?
That one seemed much less controversial according to the source, described as overwhelmingly bipartisan, necessary.
And the context was the overdose crisis.
Yeah, those devastating numbers were cited over 100,000 deaths nationwide in 2023, fentanyl being a huge driver, especially for younger people. So an area where you see some agreement across the aisle.
Gotcha. And one last D.C. point mention, something about their budget.
Right, an accusation surfaced that Congress had cut D.C.'s local budget by $1 billion. The point being made was this didn't save federal money, since it's D.C.'s own revenue, but it hurt D.C. services.
And there was a contrast drawn with the Senate.
Yeah, the Senate passed a bill quickly to reverse that cut, but the House version was just sitting there, stalled for months. Adds another wrinkle to that whole federal D.C. dynamic.
Okay, stepping back from D.C., let's look at the broader policy fights. A big one seems to be spending and the national debt focused around a major Republican bill.
Oh, yeah. And you could tell how contentious it was just by the names. Supporters called it the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
And opponents
called it a big ugly bill. That kind of framing tells you everything about the level of disagreement.
So what were Republicans claiming this bill did?
Their line was cutting wasteful spending and restoring fiscal sanity. They pushed back hard against Democratic claims about people losing health care. They said they were just preventing illegal and ineligible folks from getting Medicaid, not cutting off those who truly qualify. They even cited the New York Times and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, saying their reports showed no funding goes to undocumented immigrants anyway, so the Democratic numbers were just not true.
What were the priorities they highlighted in the bill?
Things like tax relief for seniors, more money for the border wall and border patrol, boosting the child tax credit, putting work requirements in place for welfare recipients.
Okay.
Also, getting rid of certain green energy tax credits. They called them green new scam credits. Reversing EV mandates, things like that. They framed the opposition as basically defending fraud and, quote, health care for 1.4 million illegal immigrants.
All right, so the Democratic view must have been different.
Completely different. They argued the bill was about massive tax breaks to billionaires and wealthy donors.
Paid for how?
By taking food and health care away from, quote, hungry seniors and children and millions of families. They used numbers like 16 million Americans potentially losing coverage.
And they accuse Republicans of targeting specific programs.
Yeah, gutting Medicaid and targeting Medicare, they said. And not because they had to, but because they wanted to. A huge point of attack was the deficit impact.
What did they say about the deficit?
They claimed the bill adds trillions to the deficit and debt. And they specifically cited analyses from the CDO, the Joint Committee on Taxation, University Budget Models, even the right-leaning Tax Foundation, saying all these groups agreed it would increase the deficit. They argued only House Republicans were denying it.
Strong language used.
Oh, yeah. Called it a truly grotesque set of priorities. Talked about the cruelty behind these choices. Criticized cuts to medical research at NIH, asking, if you want life-saving investments, why not fund cures for cancer or Alzheimer's? The framing was basically, this bill hurts everyone except the rich and connected.
So a classic D.C. battle over the role of government, spending, safety nets.
Textbook example. Each side using different numbers, different framing, lots of emotional language, trying to win the public argument.
And digging into the spending specifics, Republicans talked about a separate vote, a rescission package.
Right, $9.4 billion in cuts to money already allocated. They gave examples they saw as waste. Money for Iraqi Sesame Street, electric buses in Rwanda, climate projects, things they called radical gender ideology programs.
Framing it as cutting waste, fraud, and abuse.
Exactly. That's the standard justification for rescissions.
But Democrats saw that $9.4 billion differently.
Yeah, they basically called it window dressing, a tiny amount compared to the overall budget or the debt.
How tiny?
put it in perspective, $9.4 billion versus an $86 trillion 10-year spending baseline. Or, compared to how much the U.S. borrows every second, around $72,000. They argued it was a symbolic cut meant to distract from the bigger picture of borrowing.
And the bigger picture involved interest payments.
There was a stark warning cited that if interest rates go up just 1%, nearly half, 45% of all tax money could end up just paying interest on the debt, and that most of the debt increase projected is actually from interest plus Medicare costs due to, demographics, baby boomers aging.
Beyond the substance, there were also critiques of the process itself in the source material.
Yeah, one speaker really went after the Republican majority, calling it the most closed Congress ever.
Meaning what?
Meaning they claimed over 50 closed rules, like that HRS 480I, we discussed limiting debate and amendments, said over 90% of bills were take it or leave it, no real chance to change them, alleged hundreds of amendments were blocked.
Comparing it unfavorably to past Congresses.
Right. Said it was much harder for bipartisan ideas to even get a vote. The language was strong compared to House management to a wannabe authoritarian dictatorship, so real frustration with the procedures being used.
The record also shows Congress dealing with really tough international issues and how they echo back home, like anti-Semitism in Gaza.
Yes, a very sensitive discussion. There was clear condemnation of the October 7th Hamas attack, calling it an atrocity. No question about that.
And concern about rising anti-Semitism here in the U.S.
Definitely. Specific incidents were mentioned: arson, a murder near a Jewish museum, an attack in Colorado, and ADL data showing anti-Semitism at its highest levels since the 70s. There was a call for unity and mention of a proposed bipartisan commission to study it.
But then the conversation pivoted.
Crucially, yes. One speaker made a point of saying, quote, "It is not anti-Semitic to speak out against what is happening in Gaza."
And they went on to criticize the Israeli government's actions.
Strongly. Accusations of keeping food and medicine from civilians, calling it just wrong, highlighting the destruction, the tens of thousands killed or displaced.
Using terms like weapon of war.
Yes. Accusing the Netanyahu government of using food as a weapon of war deliberately imposed starvation. They cited evidence like depleted World Central Kitchen supplies, a UNICEF report showing a big jump in child malnutrition, parents watching kids waste away.
And connecting U.S. policy to this.
Arguing the U.S. is complicit because of its support for the Israeli government, and that this gives the U.S. a moral obligation and special responsibility to act, to use every leverage.
What were they calling for?
An immediate and lasting ceasefire, and the release of all hostages. Framing it not as choosing sides, but choosing a future where both Israelis and Palestinians can live safely.
They also criticized the aid distribution plans.
Called them logistically impossible, deliberately designed not to work. Mentioned chaos at distribution points, deaths, trucks piling up, cited an international criticism from allies like the UK, France, Canada.
And frustration from within Congress.
Yeah, mentioned calls for a bipartisan Senate trip to Gaza, but being denied entry. And pressure supposedly being put on Netanyahu by U.S. leaders over the images of starvation coming out. So a really complex and fraught debate playing out.
The record also shows Congress doing its oversight job, looking at what the executive branch is doing.
Right. Some routine stuff, like the president formally notifying Congress about continuing the national emergency regarding Belarus. That's just required by law.
But other things were more contentious, like the TSA program.
Yeah, the Quiet Skies program. It was noted that Governor Noem of South Dakota had ended it. But the source included accusations that the Biden administration had weaponized it against opponents, naming specific people. Ending it was framed as good news, stopping that alleged weaponization.
There was also debate about ICA actions in Los Angeles.
Descriptions of chaotic scenes, federal troops, National Guard, even Marines deployed apparently without a local request.
How is that framed?
One speaker called it chilling, a sign of straying from democratic values. Blamed it on Donald Trump, saying he created the crisis to distract and use the military to silence people. Called it deeply un-American.
But they also addressed the protesters.
Yes, called for peaceful protest. But another speaker, while agreeing violence wasn't the answer, sharply criticized sending federal troops without state consent, calling it rare and about power and intimidation.
And Senate actions, objections to EPA nominees.
Right. A senator was blocking EPA nominees except the Inspector General because of actions the Trump EPA took against California's Clean Air Act waivers. Accused the EPA of clear abuse of process, framed it as Republicans applying cooperative federalism selectively, basically not to California, on environmental issues.
And finally, on oversight. Serious accusations against President Trump.
Yes. Talk of authoritarianism, citing a Washington Post column. An actual impeachment resolution, HRES 415, was mentioned, filed based on specific alleged abuses of power, like removing someone without due process or ignoring judges. Movements pushing for impeachment were also noted.
Okay, so lots of heavy policy and political clashes. But the record isn't all that, right? There are other moments.
Absolutely. A big part of the record, often overlooked, is tributes and recognitions. Lawmakers recognizing people and groups back home.
Like who?
All sorts. Law enforcement officers, veterans like a WWII Charles Martin, students winning scholarships or art competitions, high school sports teams winning championships, mariachi bands, girls soccer, softball teams, community leaders, retiring staff, EMS services hitting 50 years, fallen officers, even requests to name ships after pioneers like the first female Navy admiral.
And recognizing anniversaries or events.
Yeah, the U.S. Army's 250th birthday got a resolution. Community groups, church centennials, town bicentennials, often with mentions of local history or heritage. Specific awareness days, too, like for Gun Violence Prevention Month or National Naloxone Awareness Day.
So it shows that other dimension of Congress connecting back to constituents and communities.
Definitely. It's not just policy debates, it's also reflecting and celebrating local life and values.
And scattered throughout, there were mentions of other policy issues, too, maybe not debated in depth that day, but still present.
For sure. Quick mentions can signal ongoing debates. Things like reforming Medicare Advantage, concerns about upcoding, calls to end fossil fuel subsidies, rural issues like funding for schools in areas with federal land.
The foreign aid came up.
Yep. Arguments about whether it serves U.S. interests, how small it is compared to other spending. Concerns about federal hiring practices, potential loyalty tests, debates over education funding, Head Start, Pell Grants.
Buzz popped up.
Mentions of solar company bankruptcies linked to tax credit uncertainty, issues at the Social Security Administration, the perennial debate over PBS funding, mental health access for pilots.
And immigration surfaced again?
Yes, particularly around the 13th anniversary of DACA. Senators sharing stories of dreamers, their contributions, their fears, the desire for a path to citizenship, framing them as American in their hearts. Also a proposal for more talent-based immigration.
Anything else jump out?
Media bias concerns. Environmental rules impacting hurricane cleanup. A bill to give Charles Rangel the Congressional Gold Medal. Support for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Listings of upcoming committee hearings on budgets and nominations. Specific bills being introduced, like one to increase penalties for rioting or even one proposing D.C. retrocession to Maryland, and a bill passed to increase sentences for crimes directed by foreign governments. Oh, and a proposed bill on crypto conflicts of interest for government officials.
Wow. Okay, so pulling it all together from this one day, June 10th, what's the overall feeling?
It's a real whirlwind, isn't it? You've got the nuts and bolts of procedure, these really intense partisan fights over big money, big social programs, deep divides on how D.C. should be run, Congress grappling with huge global issues like Gaza and seeing the fallout here with anti-Semitism, plus the oversight role, questioning the executive branch, and then those moments of local connection and recognition.
Yep.
A lot.
The main battlegrounds seem to be spending, deficits, social safety nets, that D.C. autonomy question, executive power, and maybe even a fight over what counts as truth, given the conflicting data claims.
Exactly. Disagreements over fundamental philosophies of government, but also over interpreting basic facts and figures from supposedly neutral sources like the CBO.
So, based on this snapshot, what should we be watching for next?
Well, definitely the votes on those bills bundled under HRES 489, the D.C. ones, the Fentanyl Act. How does that play out?
And that big spending bill, the big beautiful or big ugly one.
Keep an eye on that for sure. And the smaller rescission package, does it actually pass? Will there be movement on that Trump impeachment resolution, HRES 415?
What about the international and oversight stuff?
Continued debate and potential U.S. policy shifts regarding Gaza are almost certain. Developments in L.A. after those ICE actions, the outcome of those EPA nominee standoffs in the Senate, and will the House ever take up that D.C. local funds bill the Senate passed? Lots to track.
So, for you listening, how can you follow up on all this? How do you stay plugged in?
Well, first, if you want to read any of these bills yourself, like H.R. 884 on D.C. voting, or H.R. 2096 on police discipline, or S. 331 on fentanyl, the place to go is Congress.gov.
Congress.gov. You can search by bill number.
Yep. Find the text, see who sponsored it, track where it is in the process. It's the primary source.
In contacting your own representatives.
Absolutely crucial. Every senator and House member has a website. Find yours. They'll have phone numbers, email forms. Some, like the Rep. Edwards mentioned in the source, have special things like mobile office hours or online chat forms. See what your rep offers.
What about just tracking the activity generally?
Congress.gov, again, is key. Also, committee websites. If you're interested in, say, the EPA nominees, check the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee site for hearing schedules. Same for budget hearings, check the appropriations committees.
And watching for those big votes we mentioned.
Yeah, major floor action is usually highlighted on Congress.gov or on your representative's website or social media. Keep an eye out for votes on things like that rescission package or the big spending bill.
And participation goes beyond voting, right?
Totally. Contacting your reps is participation. Learning about local issues, like the D.C. governance debate highlights. Even peaceful protest, as mentioned in the L.A. discussion context. Engaging with the issues is key.
Okay, so final thought for you to chew on. We heard intense debate, especially in spending, with both sides accusing the other of basically lying, misusing data, distorting reality. So here's the question. In this environment, with such starkly different stories being told, how do you figure out what's actually going on? How do you navigate that information and decide what seems true about Congress?
Or thinking about those D.C. debates, that constant push and pull between federal power and local control, how do you think that balance should work, especially for the people living in the nation's capital? Where do you draw the line?
Something to consider. We'll leave it there for this deep dive.